Laugier was born in 1713 and would later become one of the first modern architectural theorists. He was surprisingly not an architect, but instead a Jesuit priest and later a Benedictine monk. His first book written was The History of Architecture, published in 1753. He would later go on to write 12 more books until his death in 1769. He mainly covered some familiar aspects of Renaissance and post-Renaissance architectural practices, which he described as faults. His books were also mainly based around the Industrial Revolution, French Revolution, and religious enlightenment. The Enlightenment focused on how the highest human value is reason and faith in human advancement with a goal of humanist society. Laugier emphasized on what was natural and focused on a relationship between humankind and nature. Nature was a societal norm that was considered acceptable at the time.
Laugier argued for purity in a building's formation. He believed that by stripping all decorative elements and integrating it into structure, only then can true architecture emerge. Accordingly, he heavily criticized Baroque and Renaissance architecture for its unnecessary use of pilasters, niches, and pedestals. He proposed the three essential aspects of architecture instead: the column, which was to be freestanding and round like in nature; the pediment, which was only to be on the short sides of the buildings; and flat entablatures that bar the use of arches. Through these three rules, buildings could be further rooted in nature and embrace a sense of integration between all three elements. Because of this, he gave a higher level of superiority and respect to Greek architecture, which he believes perfectly emulates his ideas. While he received much criticism for reducing architecture to extreme basics and imposing arbitrary limitations on an artist's freedom in the name of simplicity, he claimed that only untalented architects adorned his work excessively, since he was not able to reach simplicity. Only through talent and adherence to rules, he believes, can any architect be successful. Some examples of buildings that reflect aspects of his work are the Madeleine Church, Church of St. Genevieve, and the east front of the Louvre, all of which embodied the three essential principles of architecture.
The essay Sur l'architecture was written by Marc-Antoine Laugier and was the most important architecture book of the century. It was written in 1753 in the spirit of enlightenment and highly influential. He discusses his general principles of architecture and how he believes it should be founded on nature. He believes beauty, necessity, and caprice are essential. His three elements of architecture are the column, entablature, and the pediment. He also includes rules on each of these elements. For example, he says a column should be freestanding rather than against a wall, so its origin and purpose are expressed. He believes that this is the one and only way.
He also discusses the primitive hut, which is a prototype he bases everything on. Laugier believes it is the prototype for simplicity and the back-to-nature approach. He said in the essay Sur l'architecture, "All the splendors of architecture ever conceived have been modeled on the little rustic hut I have just described. It is by approaching the simplicity of this first model that fundamental mistakes are avoided and true perfection is achieved." End quote. This idea is still implemented today. Artists such as avant-garde architect/artist Perry Kopler uses his ideals of the primitive hut to then translate them into their work, using them as an element to build upon. In his book, Laugier deeply dives into rationalism and simplicity. When talking about the Maison Care in France, he says it is admired because it, quote, accords with the true principles of architecture. A rectangle where 30 columns support an entablature and a roof, closed at both ends by a pediment. That is all. The combination is of simplicity and a nobility which strikes everybody. End quote. He believes rationalism and simplicity allow for perfection and for mistakes to be avoided. His book consists of his standards or rules for architecture and believes anything that goes against these ideas are less than perfect.
Mentioned in Irina Kulevik's essay, Marc-Antoine Laugier's Aesthetic Postulates of Architectural Theory, she notes that his major contribution was establishing the valorization of a complete work of architecture, on the basis of which he noticed some errors and drew conclusions and directions for bringing architecture to perfection. Marc-Antoine Laugier's work not only had significant impact during his lifetime, but also inspired a great deal in architecture today. Firstly, his essay on architecture held major importance. In this essay, he is critical towards existing architecture. This fueled a series of debates that would directly influence the formation of the Classicism style in French architecture. Additionally, in his essay, he discusses the primitive hut principle. He argues that the primitive hut is the foundation for all built forms consisting of column, entablature, and pediment.
Different from other architectural theories, the primitive hut questioned universal architecture and would change the approach to architecture in the future. His concept was able to explore the anthropological relationship between humans and the natural environment as the fundamental basis for the creation of architecture. This generated a wide range of reactions. Some accepted it with enthusiasm, and others criticized him for reducing architecture to its simplest form. However, it established the argument for future architectural movements, ranging from the 18th century neoclassicism to the 21st century trend of simple, eco-friendly tiny homes and small dwellings. Furthermore, future architects would go on to reference his work, notably Le Corbusier. This can be seen through his 5 points of architecture, which created a strict set of rules for architecture similar to what Laugier did in his essay.
While Laugier did have an excellent point in noticing that architecture universally started with similar forms in many cultures, he did not make this universal style broad enough. To elaborate, he argued that civilization started with the primitive huts made up of posts, beams, and a gable line. However, he advocated a type of architecture that still looked distinctly Western. Japanese architecture also started with the primitive huts having exactly the same elements and as basic as Laugier describes them. But the culture evolved in such a way that its building aesthetics and structure are completely different to what Laugier advocated. This shows how civilizational regions can evolve entirely differently when isolated from each other, and that one cannot claim to be more original of the other. China is also an excellent example of distinct vernacular architecture juxtaposed with Western architecture along the line of what Laugier advocated for. Both cultures started off with their columns, pediments, and entablature, and yet the difference is uncanny when put next to each other, showcasing the distinct evolution both cultures underwent and how Laugier's philosophy still was not universal enough. China's buildings were far from the heavy stone of Grecian architecture that Laugier studied, instead being made up of rammed earth and wood. Laugier did not take into account local conditions such as material abundance and climate along with culture and philosophy.
Sometimes, the most successful examples of foreign-born architecture are ones that respect the local vernacular aesthetics. For example, a surprisingly early example of Laugier being questioned by a Westerner was the research institution of the French School of the Far East, now the Vietnam National Museum of History in Hanoi. Built during the colonial era when Vietnam was controlled by France, the structure was designed by Ernest Hébrard in 1926. Hébrard was educated at the École des Beaux-Arts, a school that championed the Beaux-Arts style, which was heavily influenced by Laugier's teachings. However, when he was appointed head of the Indochina Architecture and Town Planning Service in Hanoi, he took a slightly different approach than many others in his position. He chose to learn about and study the native architecture of Vietnam and utilize its forms to design a building that fit in with the environment and nation around it. As one can see, the building is still clearly supported by French circulation and convention, though fits quite well when compared to Vietnamese vernacular styles. This questioning of Laugier's aesthetics and philosophy is but one example of how his beliefs cannot be applied everywhere.